Okay, so chapter 5, we started last class, and deals with rhetorical techniques, ways of creating persuasion, which are not necessarily bad, all right? There may be some cases where you want to use euphemism and dysphemism, but in most cases this is going to be manipulative. It's going to be something that plays on people's emotions, their imagination, maybe their previous commitments, and it's a way of short-circuiting critical thinking. So that's why we want to pay close attention to these different rhetorical techniques. And we talked about euphemisms, dysphemisms, rhetorical explanations, rhetorical definitions. We're going to get to more rhetorical things later on. We talked about stereotypes. Stereotyping is usually going to be something that's going against critical thinking, although, you know, there could be some reasons in some cases for why stereotypes exist. It's probably going to be bad thinking if you're basing things on stereotypes, though. And then we left off talking about innuendo. So now we get to probably the most interesting type of rhetorical technique, and it's what they call a loaded question. And the classical example of this is, have you quit beating your wife? It's one of those questions that you can't answer well, because if you even buy into the question itself, the question is loaded with an assumption. So what's the assumption in that case?
That you're beating your wife.
That you are or that you have beaten your wife at some time. So if you answer yes, have you quit beating your wife? Then you have been beating your wife, and that's bad, right? And if you say no, well, that's even worse, because why are you still beating her, right? So if somebody gets to ask a question like that, and they are unchallenged, if nobody actually challenges the loaded assumption that's built into it, then it's a way of boxing somebody in. And you could do this with all sorts of things. If you ask somebody a question like, well, you did something wrong. Are you stupid or just wicked? There's a loaded question right there. And actually, loaded questions are always examples. There's some sort of assumption built in. And the question itself is always going to be what we call a dilemma. Right. And later on, we're going to see a fallacy called false dilemma. And loaded questions are, you could think of them as a type of false dilemma. Now, we're not going to get to that until a later chapter, but this is sort of good prep for them. What do you have in a dilemma? You have two choices that you can pick. So I've used this example before in class of a genuine dilemma. You know, if you ask on bended knee with the ring in your hand at the restaurant with the violins playing, will you marry me? The person who's being asked is now in a dilemma. They have really two basic choices. They can say yes or they can say anything else. And anything else is really going to, you know, in the long run, amount to no. A spontaneous yes, probably with a smile on their face, you know, or something else. It's a dilemma because you can choose one of two paths. And in a real dilemma, you can't pick both. And you can't opt out of it. So there are a lot of real dilemmas that you face in your life, right? Are you going to go to class or not go to class? That's a dilemma. It's one that you've solved already, right? But it's a genuine dilemma. With a false dilemma, you don't actually have you have two alternatives, and maybe they could both be true, or you could opt out of both of them, or maybe there's some sort of gradation between them. So with a loaded question, that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. What makes it a loaded question is that there's some sort of assumption you can identify. You know, in the have you quit beating your wife yet, the assumption is you're beating your wife. There's another good one here in the book. Have you always loved to gamble? Well, you know, how are you going to answer that? Have you always loved to gamble? No. Well, you love to gamble now, I suppose, then, right? There is the assumption. If you answer yes, well, then you're a gambler also. You could do this with any vice you like. Have you always drank too much? Or is that a new thing for you? That's implying that you do drink too much now, right? Were you always a druggie? Have you always beaten puppies? Have you always drowned kittens? Pick any sort of vicious behavior that we identify, and it would fit into this. So you see the general thing, right? Like your book says, a loaded question is not innocent. It rests on an unwarranted or unjustified assumption. If there's no reason to think that the assumption is true, then the question is a loaded question. I think this one is fairly clear, right? And you notice your book doesn't devote a lot of attention to it. Why? Because I think we catch on to this really easily. The next thing that your book talks about is, sometimes they're called, as they are in this book, Weaselers. I've also seen them called Weasel words, right? And these get used a lot in something that we've looked at before, advertising. What do weasel words allow you to do? They allow you to make a claim. And the claim appears to be fairly strong, right? Now, when you try to weasel out of something, what are you trying to do? You're trying to arrange things so that you're not held responsible. So, they make a strong claim, but then they take back the claim to some extent. And the way that these work, they are very effective. When people are taken in by weasel words, what happens is they're only listening to half of what's being said. They listen because it usually ties in with some sort of wish or desire that they have to the strong claim, and they don't notice the de-intensification, the taking back of the claim. So if I say, everybody in here could get an A by the end of the semester, what most students hear is, I'm getting an A, right? That word could, that's not saying everybody will get an A, right? That's lessening the claim. That one's fairly straightforward. There's not so much of the characteristic of weasel words built into it. So look at some of the examples that your book has. There's this great one. 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed recommend sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum. So there's, like the book points out, there's 2 different weasel words built in there. One is surveyed. If they say 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed, how many dentists do they actually have to have surveyed for that to be true? Yeah. So if Crest claims, and I don't think that Crest only interviewed 5 people, but if Crest claims 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Crest, that could be only 5 dentists total. So that's not a representative sample. Unless they're actually telling you what the figures are, you don't know how strong the claim is. It sounds very strong though, doesn't it? 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5, that's a pretty good percentage. In this one, it's got another interesting weasel word. How many dentists recommend that you actually chew gum? None. Yeah, they tend to be against that. If you are going to be chewing gum, then yeah, they would prefer that it be sugarless gum because they don't want your teeth to rot because of, the sugar in the gum, right? But dentists are generally not recommending gum, so something is being taken back here as well, right? Like it says, nothing indicates that if the sample of dentists surveyed even remotely represents the general population. If dentists actually had to answer the question, if a patient of yours insisted on chewing gum, would you prefer that it be sugarless or gum within it? They'd be in favor of sugarless, but that's not the same thing as recommending it. That's sort of like saying, you know, if you're going to perform an operation on yourself, you should probably sterilize the instrument. But should you perform an operation on yourself? No doctor is going to recommend that unless you're, you know, in a plane crash out in the Andes and there's nobody around. So you have to be careful of these sorts of words. And then he goes on and says, let's make up a statistic. Let's say 98% of American doctors believe that aspirin is a contributing cause of Ray's syndrome, and the other two are unconvinced. So now notice the word that he uses there, some. Some doctors question whether aspirin causes this, right? And for any given medical thing, you can find some doctor somewhere, somebody who's got a medical license, who doesn't believe in it, who thinks that it doesn't work. And for any really practice, any practice ranging from the totally crazy to the slightly kooky to the just unsupported, you can actually find some doctor who supports it. If you say some, how many doctors do you have to have some? One, right. So if somebody is using the word some in an advertisement, you don't actually know how many people are in favor of it. Likewise with crime. Some of us will be victims of crime. How many of us? Well, we don't know. So if we're going to think about whether to hire ADT or to carry pepper spray or, you know, who knows what else, we want to know what the actual statistics are. We don't want weasel words, because weasel words, they allow this entire range. They sound very strong, but they're actually weakening things. And the trouble is, you don't actually know where things fit in there. A lot of advertisements use that. Think about lottery advertisements. How many of you play the lottery? None of you play the lottery? Just a few. How do the advertisements always go? Do they show the millions of people who don't win anything? No. They never show somebody ripping up their ticket and saying, God, you know. Oh, you want to, apparently you can buy lottery tickets, fake lottery tickets. I just found out about this last week. You can buy fake lottery tickets as a gag that actually convince the person that they've won like $1 million or $10,000. And then of course on the back it says, what are your odds of winning 0, right? As opposed to like 15,000 to 1 or, you know, whatever. So what do they show instead in the ads? They'll show like a big ball of money and it rolls through the guy's house, or money raining down. What were you going to say?
That giant check that they use.
Oh yeah, yeah, and they use that for Publishers Clearinghouse too, right? Which is still going strong. Publishers Clearinghouse is another great example of weasel words, because they send, have you guys, any of you gotten those things? They come in the mail and they say, you have won.
One of the following.
Yeah.
I won a car the other day.
Now, if you look at the fine print, there's an if there, and that if is the weasel word. The if is if your number matches the winning number. But it reads as if you've already won it. A lot of car dealerships do this too these days. They send out these I don't know what you would call them. They're not quite advertisements. They're,
I got one the other day.
yeah, they're ways to try to get you to come down to the dealership on a certain day. Yeah, that's...
You guarantee the prize too. My 4 prizes were a car, an iPad, $150.
Or a sticker gun.
But when you read, it says up to $150.
Oh.
The minimum prize is $2. But it doesn't tell you that you have to read all the fine print.
Yeah, up to is another example of a weasel word, because if you say up to $1,000, $1,000 sounds great. Most people focus on that. The up to means it could be just, you know,
A penny.
yeah, because that's the lowest amount that we have in our culture, right? I will give all of you up to 50 points of extra credit. And that doesn't mean I'm going to give you any points of extra credit, right? I'm not actually committing myself to much there. So like he says, words that sometimes weasel, like perhaps, possibly, maybe, among others, those can be used as weasel words. They can also be used to plant innuendos. You can say, well, perhaps they're telling the truth. If you say that about somebody, remember about innuendo, you're saying they usually lie. You're implying that. Now, like he points out, though, not every use of words and phrases like this is a weaseling one. Sometimes they're weaseling when they're being used to sort of, sucker you into looking at the strong claim. Sometimes they're used to do what we call qualifying. So if I, for example, you asked me about how am I going to do on the final exam. If I say, well, I mean, your performance so far has been, getting B's on the exams, and you seem to be understanding what's going on in the class, and if your previous performance is a good index of your later performance, I think that you'll get a B. I'm qualifying that, right? I'm not actually using weasel words. I'm not trying to trick you. But I can't narrow it down and say, you will definitely get a B, because I don't know the future. And, just as with the stock market, with grades, how does the phrase go that they have in every single stock thing that you buy? Previous performance does not necessarily indicate future performance, I think is how it goes. What are they doing there? They're qualifying their assessments. Your book has an example of police work, right? Police work is very rarely 100% definite. When people go to court, when people are arrested, when people go to prison, it's not every case where, they checked every single lead out, closed off every possible alternative, proved conclusively, not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond any doubt that the person was guilty. But they can say, well, probably that's the case. They're qualifying things there. So it's not as if we should then suddenly say, well, everybody's been convicted on weasel words. That's not the case. Your book has an example of somebody saying, it's possible that Smith is lying. It is possible sometimes. That's not necessarily a weasel word. Although if it's being used with rhetorical force, then it could be, or it could be an innuendo. So all of you see how these work? Fairly clear about that? Okay, another closely related one is what your book calls downplayers. This is a little bit murkier, I think. When I've taught this material before, I see students, rightly so, blurring together downplayers, weaselers, innuendo, and that's okay, because sometimes these techniques can overlap with each other. Sometimes they can be used in conjunction with each other. Sometimes they can merge into each other. What is a downplayer? A downplayer, like he says, is an attempt to make something or something look less important or less significant. So that's not a bad definition. Attempt to make something or someone look less significant. So when might you do this? Or when might somebody do this to you? Well, if your case isn't that good, and the other person's case is good, then, one way to deal with that is to use downplayers, isn't it? Let's say they have authorities on their side. Well, what can you do? You can try to weaken their authorities. That's one way of...
Pros and cons.
Pros and cons. Could that...
They can try to downplay with the con there.
Okay, that's a good example. Yeah, if let's say you're getting together, you're having some sort of decision, right? I remember when I was a kid, my mom started doing this. We would have these family meetings, and at the family meetings we had to each come up with a budget, and that was kind of a pain, but it was a good thing to learn. And if we wanted to get any money for things, it had to be in the budget, right? So I had to learn how to budget things. And then we would bring up issues, and before we would make a decision, you know, actually if it was a decision that we got to participate in, a lot of the decisions, you know, she was the parent, she made it, right? But if it was a decision that we got to participate in, she would make us make up a pro and con list. And did any of you have to do anything like that when you were kids? You may want to start considering doing that for your own life, especially if you know, end up having a spouse or some other partner, because you won't see eye to eye to them, eye to eye with them on everything. I can tell you that from not only my experience, but the collective experience of nearly everybody who's been in a relationship throughout the history of time, right? You won't see eye to eye with them on everything. So a pro and con list, you know, listing the advantages and disadvantages of things. Now, if you really want to do that thing, you're going to have a tendency to downplay the con side. Well, that's not really a disadvantage, because that's not that likely to happen. Or, you know, if that happens, we can take care of that. If you really don't want to do the thing, you'll downplay the pro side. Well, yeah, that does sound like a really great opportunity, but, you know, most of these things don't pan out, and you probably really wouldn't like that anyway. So we're not going to go with it. So yeah, you're right. Ms. Mayfield has a good example of something where downplayers could come into play. If you have authorities, then you know the other person may try to downplay your authorities. Or if you have, actually sometimes if you have competing authorities, you might try to downplay the other person's authorities. And your book gives some good examples of this. One way you can do it is by using stereotypes. We talked about this before. If you're talking to a crowd that's conservative, then if you point out that the opposing expert is a liberal, that might do the trick, right? Even if they're right. Likewise, if you're in a liberal crowd and you point out that the opposing person has got a voting record of being a conservative, or they're a Republican or something like that, that may disqualify them in the other people's eyes. Not unnecessarily wrongly, right? Because if they're really an expert, they're an expert. Unless you can actually prove that they are biased, it's not a good technique. Often they use the phrase just another. That person is just another so-and-so. So that's downplaying them. That's trying to minimize their influence. It's got this great example here too. Mere and merely. Right? Somebody's a mere yellow belt, or somebody's a mere college professor. Right? The word mere, the way it works, it tends to make us think of things as being littler, as being less important. So, how many of you have actually done any martial arts? If you have, you'll understand this example. Kim tells you that she has a yellow belt in the Tibetan martial art of Pujo, and her sister has a mere green belt. So it sounds like her sister is not as good as she is. What's the problem there?
The green belt's higher.
Yeah, in most martial arts systems, you go from like a white belt to a yellow belt, that's the next stage, to an orange belt, to green, to blue, to brown, to black, And if it's, if it's the kind of place where they're just churning out black belts, then they have a whole bunch of steps in between, and you got to pay for each one on the way. One of the ones that my kids went to, they actually had first you'd have the white belt, and you'd get a yellow stripe. Then you'd get the yellow belt, then that would get an orange stripe. And that was a little bit silly. But you notice there's actually sort of a ranking system. And somebody may say mere. Think about professors. Which sounds better to you? Associate professor or assistant professor? Yeah. Now, a lot of people don't know which is which. They know that professor, just with the word by itself, that's the top. But which is actually higher, assistant or associate? Some people think assistant is. So I'm an assistant professor here. And let's see, Richard Hall, who's just down the hall from here, he made associate status last year, I believe. So let's say he comes in and I say, well, you don't want to listen to him. He's a mere associate professor. I'm an assistant professor. If you didn't know the difference, I would be using a downplayer, and you would think that somehow I have a higher rank than he does, wouldn't you? People who don't know rank in military systems or police systems, that person's a mere captain. You don't have to listen to them. Listen to the lieutenant instead. Well, no, a lieutenant is lower rank than the captain, right? In every service you pick. So those are all types of downplayers. There's another one that it talks about, which is using quotations, right? And sometimes you see people doing this with their hands and gestures. They go, so-and-so is a supposed expert, right? And they go like this to imitate quotations. What are they doing there? By putting it in quotations, you're saying it's not really what the word says. So a so-and-so is an expert. Well, you're trying to say they're not really an expert then, aren't you? Some people think they're an expert, but they're not really an expert. You can do this with anything you like. Professor Sadler says XYZ. If you're doing that like in a newspaper article, you're doing that with the intent of, using a downplayer. Look for somebody, if they're talking about me that way, look for them to be trying to discredit whatever it is that I'm saying in some way. If they do this about you, if you see things about your qualifications put in quotation marks like that, look out. Somebody is trying to use downplayers on you. Why do we do this? Well, again, to try to persuade people using rhetoric. Your book has a couple of good examples of this. She got her degree from a correspondence school, right? There's actually some correspondence schools that are quite good. But what's the general reputation for correspondence schools? Not good. They're diploma mills, John borrowed Hank's umbrella, and Hank hasn't seen it since. Borrowed being used there as a sort of code. Yes, for stolen. So now it says a lot of conjunctions, like nevertheless, however, still, and but, can also be used to downplay claims that precede them. So here's one example. Although it's true that pesticide plants are an integral part of the Green Revolution that has helped to feed millions of people, it was just such a plant that developed a leak and produced a terrible tragedy. That's one way to talk about something. Now here's another way to talk about it. The leak at the plant was a terrible tragedy. All right. However, there's the downplayer. We must remember that such pesticide plants are an integral part of the Green Revolution that's helped to feed millions of people. It's downplaying the fact that people died because of the plant, right? Also, he talks about context. There's this great example. Consider the remark, Chavez won by only 6 votes. Only might be a downplayer. If there were 1,000 votes, that's a pretty close election, isn't it? If somebody only won by 6 votes. Guaranteed that these days, if somebody won by 6 votes, there'll be a recount. What if it's a department meeting and your department only has 8 people and you're electing a department chair and Chavez won by 6 votes? What's the story then? Yeah, he won by a landslide, or she won by a landslide. So it really depends on the context, doesn't it? And the word only there could be a way of tricking you into buying some sort of claim that's not true, or not accepting a claim that is true. Now, there's something that the book points out here that I think is useful to emphasize at this point. like it says, as mentioned earlier, slanters, and what do they mean by slanters? All these different rhetorical techniques that get used, like euphemism, euphemism. Some of these can't be avoided. Even things like merely or only. They, like it says, they give our writing flair and interest, and nobody wants to take your interesting characteristics away from you. But you want to be aware when you're using these, because you will be tempted to use these to oppose people that you don't like or causes that you don't like, and you really want to be aware of these when other people are using these on you or against causes that you do like. Like it says, learn to appreciate the effects that subtle and not so subtle manipulations of language can have on you. And if you do that, you can actually become a better writer. That's one reason why they teach, when they call it a composition, it's actually rhetoric and composition. They're teaching you how to make your writing appealing. Let's go on now to horse laugh. And this is a term we don't use anymore. It used to be kind of a common term. What's a horse laugh? It doesn't mean that you actually sound like a horse. It's where you just sort of laugh out loud at somebody. You kind of ridicule them. It says the kind of rhetorical device we call horse laugh uses includes the use of ridicule of all kinds. You can just start laughing at somebody's claim. I've actually done this, not actually meaning to, but I've been asked questions by students sometimes that are so bizarrely off the wall that you just can't help but laugh at them. You notice I haven't done that here in this class. Have I done it at all this semester? I don't think so. But every once in a while, somebody will ask something that's just so ridiculous that myself, I like to laugh, so I have a hard time not laughing at that sort of thing. Now, some people will do that just to try to put people down, right? Laughter is a very powerful tool. As a matter of fact, sometimes laughter can be very useful for attacking injustice. You can point. Sometimes that may be your only tool. Usually here in the United States, it's not. But sometimes making fun of things, satire, ridicule, that can change people's minds. That can deflate the sort of sense that authorities are undefeatable. And it has been used. Ridicule has been used to attack a lot of unjust regimes. But it can also just as much be used to attack ordinary people making true claims. As a matter of fact, the regime can, any regime that's in place can make somebody look ridiculous. Especially if they have control over, like here in the United States, nobody actually has control over, say, the media, right? In some countries, the media is state-controlled. So, think about China, for example. Most of the media in China is state-controlled, or at least state-censored. As a matter of fact, even the internet in China. When the revolution started in Egypt, China actually blocked searches of the word Egypt. And I think they still are currently. So if you're in China and you type in Egypt into a search engine, nothing will come up. So in a case like that, the regime can also use techniques like this. If you're somebody who says, well, we want democracy in China, and there are a lot of people who do, they can just make fun of you. Look at that ridiculous person. That would be an example of this. Political opponents do this to each other all the time. Like it says, one may simply laugh outright at a claim, send aid to Russia, and then they start laughing. They can laugh at another claim that reminds them of the first. Support the Equal Rights Amendment. Sure, when the ladies start buying the drinks, that's a little bit dated. The Equal Rights Amendment was something they were trying to pass when I was a kid. And it was supposedly going to grant or secure equal rights for women in the workplace and some other things. I don't really even remember the specifics because I was so young when they were debating it. It never passed. But you see the general idea here, right? We'll support equal rights when the women start buying the drinks. It's kind of funny, right? Today, even still, if you go out to the bars, are women buying the majority of the drinks? No. Right? That's part of the dating scene, I or you know, whatever scene you want to call it, the club scene. But you know, what's it being used for in this case? It's being used to attack a political proposal. So it's being used as a rhetorical technique. Yeah, you can tell an unrelated joke. You can use sarcastic language. Sometimes you can just repeat what the person is saying, but you know, change the tone of voice, and then they look stupid, don't they? That's a technique. There are people who've actually built their entire careers off of satire. Think about Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, which unfortunately more students get their news from than from actual news shows. Or at least that was what statistics were a little while ago. Jon Stewart is not actually giving you any straight news. He's a comedian. Same thing with the Colbert Report, which is really over the top. You know, Colbert pretends to be a sort of hardcore right-winger, when he's actually, you know, fairly left-wing in real life. What's he doing there? He's actually using satire to attack political opponents, and this is done quite frequently. You can do this visually too. Think about when you see those political cartoons. How do they portray Obama? What's the one feature in political cartoons that they zoom in on? His ears, right? They have him with, you know, big Dumbo-like ears. Why do they do that? That's a way to try to sort of deflate a person's authority. George Bush's father, George Bush Sr., I remember he was portrayed, bless you, as being a whim. So they would always draw him with a purse, carrying a purse around. He was Reagan's vice president, so he was seen as sort of Reagan's, you know, lapdog. There's all sorts of visual imagery like that. I mean, you can do things that kind of pump people up visually. Think about those. The Obama campaign was very good with using that. You remember that famous red, white, and blue hope, and it shows him, you know, looking up and all that sort of stuff. That's staging. That's, you know, a form of rhetoric as well. But you can use it the other way to try to diminish a person, and that's what people do with their opponents. Do they do that in advertising? Do you remember that? Was it the Subway ad or they were attacking the Subway ad? One of the ones that we saw. Who was it? Quiznos? Remember with the dog jumping? In the Blackboard ads that I put up for you guys? I guess not a lot of you actually took a look at those Blackboard ads.
I thought the Marvel
There wasn't a Marlboro one though. There was a not a Camel, a Winston ad.
Winston,
yeah. Well, with Fred and Barney. Yeah. Yeah, you know, advertisements, sometimes they will belittle their opponents. And that, again, that's a rhetorical technique. What happens when we start laughing at somebody? We tend to think less of them, don't we? Whether we mean to or not. So, I'm actually going to leave off here because hyperbole takes a little bit longer to explain. So again, what I'd like to emphasize for you, with these rhetorical techniques, you want to start becoming attuned to these.